Hello, my name is Emily Owens, and I'm the State Director for Virginia Science Olympiad. In this video, I'll discuss how to read an event schedule, particularly when it comes to event conflicts, and how coaches can use this information to make event assignments for their team rosters. First, if you are new to Science Olympiad and have never been to a Science Olympiad tournament before, I encourage you to start by watching our What is Science Olympiad video before diving into the details of event schedules and assignments. Science Olympiad tournaments have multiple events happening at the same time so that we can fit them all into one day. You'll notice on this example tournament schedule below that we have groupings of events that overlap with one another. For example, experimental design and fossils happen at the same time for a team, and then entomology and potions of poisons happen at the same time for that team in another session. These event conflicts are going to be the focus of this presentation so that coaches can make appropriate event assignments for rosters to avoid these conflicts on tournament day. I will point out, though, that at the bottom of this schedule, you'll see a handful of events that are running all day, and these are ones that are scheduled in by coaches to select time slots for their teams closer to the tournament day itself. Each year, VASO publishes a listing of our event groupings. This list is the 2025 season list for Division B. These groupings align with the national groupings published in the back of the national rulebook and that are used at the national tournament. Each grouping of events tells you that they will happen at the same time during our tournaments. For example, Group A tells us that disease detectives, meteorology, and metric mastery will happen during the same time slot for a team at a tournament. And that will be a different time slot than Group B, entomology, potions and poisons, and write it, do it. VASO also selects some events each year that will only be run at certain tournaments. These are the red text events in this example, that in the 2025 season, these events are only run at the National Ready Regional and at the state tournament. So not all events are run at every tournament, but these groupings are consistent across all VASO tournaments. If you're a school that fields both divisions B and C as teams, I also want to point out that event conflicts don't necessarily line up across divisions. In fact, they rarely do. Let's take, for example, experimental design and fossils, which do conflict with each other in this 2025 Division B example. This means that students who are in fossils cannot compete in experimental design since they're in the same grouping. However, those two events also show up in the 2025 Division C schedule, and they do not conflict with each other. They're in separate groups. So a Division C student could compete in fossils as well as experimental design, since they are guaranteed to not happen in the same time slot. You'll also notice on these event groupings that the column all the way to the right lists our self-scheduled events. These events, because they are scheduled in by coaches, don't have any built-in conflicts already. So those groupings of A through F tell you what events will conflict with each other, but you won't know the exact time that those events happen at a given tournament until you get team numbers closer to tournament day. So let's take our experimental design and fossils example for Division B. We know from the previous event grouping shown that they conflicted in this schedule for the 2025 season in Division B. You'll see, though, that they are offered for 3 sessions, sessions 1, 2, and 3 in this example tournament schedule. This does not mean, though, that your team would get to pick which time they do experimental design and which time they do fossils. Instead, the team number will decide which session they attend. So let's say your team was assigned Team 13. They would be doing experimental design and fossils both in session 2 from 10:05 to 11 o'clock. These assignments of session times will not be changed by VASO, so it's important that coaches pay attention in advance to these conflicts to avoid any problems on tournament day. Let's walk through an example of how I might use a team roster and these event conflicts to assign students to different events. I've selected two event groupings from the 2025 Division B slate. Group A with 3 events that overlap with each other, and Group E that are 3 events that overlap with each other. Group A and E will not overlap across one another, though. And then I've also selected some example self-scheduled events. But before I start placing student names, let's consider my rosters. Let's say that I'm at a school that fields 2 teams. I'll have 2 separate team rosters of students. Now, my examples aren't a full 15 of students, but they don't have to be. I've just used a smaller sample for the sake of this example. If your school fields multiple teams, students can only partner with other members of their specific team. So you'll have a different event schedule for each of your rosters. So let's say that I'm going to build an event schedule for my Team 1 roster. Here's what I've come up with. I'm going to give you a minute to look and see what errors I have made, because there are a few. Did you catch them? Let's start with one. Notice that Carter is assigned to work on an event with Jana in Group E, Fossils. However, Carter's name does not show up on my Team 1 roster. In fact, he was on my Team 2 roster. But these rosters must remain separate, so I can't have Carter work on an event with Jana unless I'm going to move him to my Team 1 roster. Instead of doing that, I'm going to replace him with someone who is on my Team 1 roster. Chris is on my Team 1 roster, so he's free to work with Jana on any event, but I can put him with her for Fossils B. There's another error on here as well. Notice that I've scheduled Jana for 2 events in the same group. This means that those events will be happening at the same time. And Jana can do a lot of things, but she can't be in 2 places at once. So I have to make a change and remove her from one of these event assignments and replace her with somebody else. So let's say that I'll take Jana off of Metric Mastery and replace her with Garrett. Now there are no conflicts in Group A for my students. Now you might be wondering why I had to make that change in Group A, but I didn't have to make that change in the self-scheduled column. Garrett's listed for 2 events there. Don't those conflict? Well, no, they're self-scheduled. So as a coach, I can sign up for 2 different time slots to make sure that Garrett can do both events during tournament day. And I'll also pay attention to his other events to make sure that they don't conflict with Metric Mastery. I control the times at which my students will compete in those self-scheduled events, so I can make sure that I'm not double booking anybody in my selections. There's one other thing that you might have noticed about this event scheduling example. I have 3 students listed for experimental design. And you might think that that's not allowed or that I've made an error. But it turns out that experimental design is an event that has 3 students allowed to work together. For every event, the number of students allowed in that event is in the rule book, so you can always consult that when making your event assignments. Most events are simply for 2 students, as represented by this setting here. But there are some that will allow for 3, notably experimental design and Codebusters, though there are others sometimes in different years. So that's how you can make sure that you're following all the conflict guidelines when assigning students into different events. But while that's just the logistical side of putting them into spaces, you might have a lot of questions about how you know what spaces they want to be in. And ultimately, as the coach, you get to choose how you collect event preferences from your students to help you make those assignments. No matter which way you choose to do this, it is helpful to set the expectation with students and families that students may not always get all of their first choice events due to a number of reasons like these event conflicts. If they've picked 2 events that happen in the same group, they can't do both. You also have to consider team needs as you're trying to build a schedule to cover as many events as you'd like, and also evenly distributing events across the roster so that some students aren't doing way more events than other students. Here are just a few examples that veteran coaches have shared with us about how they collect student event preferences, though you can also always choose your own way to do this. One option to consider is to put that information about event preferences in your team application or commitment form, whether you do it on paper or collect it online, like in a Google form. You can ask students to rank their event preferences generally, or even rank them by event grouping within the event grouping. You can also ask for event mentor preferences from parents too, if that's something that your team is going to pursue. You can see an example of a commitment form that asks for all of this information on our resources page. Another option you can consider would be a gallery walk activity that you can do after your team has been selected. You don't have to use event preferences as part of your team application or tryout. You could use this after you've selected the team on other criteria. This idea comes from veteran coach Leah Pulick at Langley High School, where she uses one of her first practices with her team members to consider their events that are posted on large paper around the room, and she gives each student a set of Post-it notes to write their name on. They get to go around the room and look at the rules for the events and look at what events other people are interested in, and they can put their Post-it notes with their names on them on the events that they'd like to be considered for. This is an interesting way to also have students considering events that might be more or less popular, since we know ultimately coaches are going to have to make decisions for how to cover all the events, not just the ones that are the most popular. Some other things to keep in mind. You are making decisions for a collaborative team, not for individual students. And so this may mean, as I said before, that students are not always getting their first event choices. Students need to have a collaborative spirit, and this is a great first way to talk about it. You also don't have to have a full team of 15 students. You could have a team that has 5 students or 10 students. You also, if you field multiple teams, don't have to have balanced teams. You could have a full first team and a smaller second team. You don't have to do all events at a given tournament either. If you're a really small team, you might not be able to cover all 23 events at a tournament. Or if you have multiple teams, your different teams don't have to compete in the same number of events. You could have different events within different teams. Then that's totally up to you. Though I will say at our regional tournaments, teams that qualify for state more often are the ones that participate in all events at their regional tournament site. Each team also, no matter how many events you cover or how many teams you have, each team can only submit one set of students to compete in a given event. As you're collecting information from your students about their event preferences, it may be useful to also ask for prior event assignments and results from returning team members, especially if you're a new coach coming to an existing program. It also may be useful to collect information about how many years they've been doing Science Olympiad and what their general event interests are, so that you can use this to inform your decision about keeping event loads balanced, especially for students who indicate that they are new to Science Olympiad. Things to keep in mind for balancing include the total number of events. You want to make sure that students have an event load that they can handle. 6 events is probably too many for most competitors, especially ones starting out. Whereas 1 event only might be too little to actually keep them engaged. For teams that are fielding 15 student teams at a state tournament or a tournament that covers all 23 events, this usually balances out to about 3 to 4 events per team member. VASO runs fewer events at most of our regionals, though, and so for those smaller tournaments, that might be more like 2 to 3 events per team member. You may have experienced competitors that can handle larger event loads, and that is your discretion about giving them more events than the average. But I would caution that it makes a schedule harder to build, especially for those self-scheduled events, the more events a particular competitor takes on. Also, please keep in mind the state-only events when assigning. If you assign a student to only the events in red that were state only, and you're not competing at the National Ready Regional, that means they won't have any events to compete in at the regional tournament. Rather, it might be useful to distribute those state-only events across your roster to make sure that everybody has an equitable regional experience. Also, you should be paying attention to build events, especially for new competitors. They don't yet know the workload that comes with a construction event and the time and energy it takes to construct a device. You might have experienced competitors that can handle multiple build events and have done it in seasons past, and that's okay. They're allowed to do that. But for your new competitors, we would encourage you to consider assigning only one build event and then giving them a sampling of other events in other realms like our knowledge and hands-on events. Also remember that if you have multiple teams at your school, even though they compete against each other on tournament day, they can support each other in preparation. So when you're assigning events across your teams, your team 1 fossils duo can work together with your team 2 fossils duo, and they'll just compete head to head when it comes to the actual tournament. You can always change event assignments from one tournament to the next based on team needs or what students are able to attend on given days. VASO never asks you for your individual event assignments. All we'll ask you for is your 15-person roster of names. So you can make changes as needed. Something else you can consider is assigning the state-only events later on if your team does qualify for state. If you're not competing at the National Ready Regional, you don't necessarily have to assign those states-only events just yet. Unless, of course, you are wanting to attend an invitational earlier in the season that does include them and you want those students to have that experience. So it's up to you whether you assign all events at the very beginning or wait until state qualification to assign those states-only events. If you do swap students around as you're adjusting from tournament to tournament, please make sure that you're preserving the 15-person rosters. You can have no more than 15 people on a team, and if you're a Division C coach, you can have no more than 7 seniors on a given team. And only those 15 on a roster can compete together in events. We track this at tournaments by using different colored wristbands and checking names on score sheets. Please know that even though VASO publishes event groupings that are consistent with the national rulebook, other tournaments, namely invitationals, may make some changes to suit their particular tournament needs. So it's important to always check the specific tournament schedule and adjust your assignments accordingly in advance so that no one is surprised on tournament day. The biggest piece of advice I have for you in all of this is to keep it organized in whatever way works for you. Use a Google or Excel sheet to keep track of rosters and event assignments. You can check out our resource page for a general example of one, or you can create your own. This is handy because you can duplicate sheets to make adjustments by tournament. In whatever form you choose, we suggest publishing clear event assignments for every tournament for students and families to review so that they know what events are being run at a given tournament and what events their students will actually be competing in. This may sound like a lot of upfront work, but I promise you, the time and attention that you give to this at the beginning of the season will pay off later when tournament prep ramps up. Thanks for watching, and we hope you have found this video to be helpful. Be sure to check out our website and our social media platforms.